All right, let's get started. We will have a public session now, which will last with questions and so on about an hour. So during the talk, feel free to ask questions, and Neelima will respond as appropriate, depending on whether she wants on the question later or answer them right away. Let's get started. We will have a public session now, which will last. Hold on a moment. I hear.
Is my video?
Yeah, I think so. So please hold on. We are having technical issues. Later or answer them right away. Hold on. I hear. Yeah, I think so. So please hold on. We are having technical issues. Yeah. Okay, I think we're back. So let's get started. I'm going to give a brief introduction to Neelima, but also to the broader topic of what her dissertation is about, just so people have some context. So it's my pleasure to introduce Neelima Sharma, who is defending a thesis today. She did her bachelor's in biotechnology from Delhi University, and then was a research scholar at the National Center for Biological Sciences in Bangalore for a few years, which is really where our paths first crossed, this was my past employment. And then she and I moved to Yale, where Neelima did her graduate work, including a master's and an MPhil along the way, and today she's presenting her dissertation work. So really, the work that Neelima is going to tell us about is part of a very long-standing and continuing debate, I would say, across evolutionary biology, topic of biomechanics, control theory, robotics, many related areas. We all know that when we see an animal do something really remarkable, we look at it and attribute their skills just as casual observers to, oh, it's because it has a limb, it's because it has something shaped this way. We attribute the skills to features of the body, sometimes to the more nebulous idea of, oh, it has good motor skill. That's one point of view of animals. The viewpoint is that function is because of form and control. One can argue the flip side, and that's in the context of evolution. You can even argue that machines evolve with generation cycles defined by graduate students in the context of robots, for example. And there, we attribute the shape of the animal to what function it accomplishes. But it's not surprising, I would say, that there are a lot of debates on this topic, because what is function is really at the heart of the debate. I mean, these debates have continued in evolutionary biology, for example, between Stephen Jay Gould and John Maynard Smith on the question of, is it optimality that's governing how evolution works, or is it other necessary constraint satisfaction that the animal has to achieve? There were parallel debates in the context of control theory, for example, between optimality and stability. So Neelima's work in particular is an experimental mathematical deep dive into questions of stability. These grand sounding questions may never be resolvable, but her work is going to tell us some resolutions in the context of specific examples. So I won't tell you what those examples are, because Neelima is going to tell us about it. With that, Neelima.
Hi, thank you for the introduction, Madhu. Okay, so I'm going to dive right into my thesis. The title of my thesis is on the role of stability in animal morphology and neural control. And I'm going to talk about two example studies which highlight this point. But before I delve into that, I want to get my pointer here. Yeah. Talk about how mechanical stability is vital for fitness and survival of animals. So we know that humans and animals are extremely adept at dexterous tasks. For example, here we can see a person watchmaking. They are applying negative forces, maintaining postures, or below a lion just roaming around while maintaining a stable posture and not falling. On the right-hand side, we have robots, which have really fancy feedback controllers that have noise and delays much lower than what sensory motor feedback in humans or animals do. And yet they are extremely inadept at dexterous tasks. For example, here you can see that they can't even stand still. It's very hard for them to hold things and maintain their postural stability. And in the video below, we can see that the robot goes into these high frequency oscillations when the person contacts the robot with a stiff posture. So contact stability is a problem with robots. Maintaining postural stability is a problem with robots. Robots, something that we don't even think about when we are performing these different tasks. For example, walking is a no-brainer for us. So we all know, so where does the stability come from when animals are performing motor tasks? And we can classify these into many different kind of responses that body has, but I am discussing 3 of them here. First is morphology. So animal morphology is important, and there are several examples. For example, at the bottom here, there's an experiment which shows that when people are locomoting or walking, lateral stability is has a simple relationship with the stance width of the animal. So the greater your base of support, the more stable you are against perturbations. And when you're stabilized laterally, your stance width decreases, suggesting that, again, morphology can be controlled neurally to garner you stability. At the top here, I have a photograph of an insect, but the point I want to highlight is that insects have flexural joints, which means that they have passive ligaments that are surrounding their joints and establish a neutral posture of the joint. So the insect can move one way by applying active forces using their muscles, but as soon as they stop applying any kind of active muscular forces, the joint just simply comes back because the neutral posture has been defined. That's not true for us, for example. So morphology determines stable motor function. Second, coming to intrinsic mechanical response of the muscle, this is, along with the morphology, is the first line of defense against any kind of external perturbation. And I say that because feedback, which I will come to last, is associated with delays. And it's only after 50 or 60 milliseconds that you can control or stabilize yourself against perturbations using feedback control. So intrinsic mechanical response of the muscle also helps you maintain stable posture. For example, there's evidence that when you're standing, muscle stiffness, which originates in the cross stretches of the muscle, the actin myosin cross stretches not only produce tension that produces muscle forces, but also act as strings that applies joint stiffnesses in order to ensure stability. So that helps you stand or maintain postures. And you can also learn how to control your posture in presence of destabilizing force fields by using feedback control. So this last study here shows that when people are trying to do an arm pointing exercise in a destabilizing force field, they learn to modulate the impedance, which is a combination of stiffness, damping, and inertia terms, to stabilize themselves. So here, the null field, they are very good at arm pointing exercises, but when the divergent field is present, they are initially not so great at reaching the task goal. However, with learning, they understand how to modulate the impedance and reach the final goal. So all these examples tell us that form and neural control play a role in mechanical stability of motor tasks. However, we ask the opposite question. In this work that I'm going to present today, we are asking if stability plays a role in animal form and function. And the argument that lead me to this proposition are that animal morphology and neural control of animal morphology are the first line of defense against any kind of external perturbations, because feedback, as we discussed, is associated with noise and delays. And stable function is necessary for defining animals' fitness and survival, which is under pressures of natural selection by evolution. So we propose that open loop stability, by which I mean stability that does not rely on feedback, which are dependent on noise and delays, acts as a constraint and a driving factor that has led to evolution of morphologies and of learning of different motor control strategies for performing tasks stably. Okay. So I'm going to show this to you using two example studies. I have broken down my title into two different titles. The first part of my talk is going to talk about the role of stability in animal morphology. And the second part is going to discuss neural control and how that helps you maintain stable finger posture when you're applying fingertip forces. So first part of my talk, we know this is a common observation that small animals maintain a sprawling posture. So they have a wider base of support as compared to their height, whereas larger animals such as elephants or lions are more slender when seen in the front profile. So this can be quantitatively characterized by something called an aspect ratio, which is simply the ratio of the width of the base of support to height of the animal. So smaller animals have a large aspect ratio, whereas larger animals are more upright. This is a common observation, but there has never been any data that verifies whether there is a scaling between aspect ratio and size of the animal. And so we went out and we collected data for 366 animals, where we used the frontal profile photographs of the animals to measure their aspect ratio by finding the base of support and height of center of mass. And we we measured the masses of various animals. So these are the different animals we collected data for. They range from small insects to reptiles, birds, and large mammals. And this is what we find. So aspect ratio plotted against the mass of the animal, which is a measure of the size of the animal, shows a trend such that aspect ratio decreases as the size of the animal increases. So aspect ratio greater than 1 suggests a sprawling posture, such as found in insects, and something that's smaller than 1 is a slender posture, such as found in animals. So next, we probe what underlies the scaling of aspect ratio with size. And the existing hypotheses that talk about the scaling or talk about why larger animals maintain an upright posture and therefore a slender posture rely on stress hypothesis, which says that to reduce joint torques or muscle stresses for large animals, what they do is they align their limbs closer to the ground reaction forces in order to reduce any kind of skeletal stresses in order to support their body weight. Smaller animals, on the other hand, maintain a crouched posture because they are limited by the power limits of their muscles, and they want to increase the stance phase duration, which can allow them to provide enough work for locomotion. So these hypotheses are vigorously debated, and the role of environment in maintaining locomotion stability has not been considered before. In particular, we know that the Earth's terrain is uneven, and how that unevenness plays a role in determining locomotion stability has not been considered previously. So locomotion stability has two aspects. One is the fore-aft stability, which is the dynamic gait that you control while you're walking in the sagittal plane. And the second is lateral stability, which is that you do not want to tip and fall sideways. So active neural control affects both these stabilities. However, lateral stability has been found to have a simple relationship with the body posture, as I was discussing before, that the stance width determines how stable you are against the tilting perturbations. The wider your base of support, the more resistances you can apply to lateral tilting perturbations. Now we know that natural terrain, this is Earth's terrain, which I have tried to draw here, is a natural source of tilting perturbations to locomoting animals. And we also know that the roughness or the terrain statistics, the roughness of the terrain is size dependent. And therefore, this leads us to hypothesize whether maintaining passive lateral stability of the frontal profile is related to the scaling of frontal aspect ratio of animals with their size. So so again, in more precise terms, the stability hypothesis states that when an animal is standing on a terrain, the aspect ratio is determined by the marginal stability conditions, which means that the tilt induced.
There's a question from Madhav in the audience.
Yeah.
Neelima, I just wanted to ask, I mean, the local statistics of terrain vary from different places, and you have the geographical locations of the animals that you saw. So can you explain more of the noise and the scatter that you had? I mean, overall, of course, there was a trend, but is there some overall sort of trend in the scatter where the local terrain statistics explain more of that spread?
That's a great question, and I'm going to show you more. I'm going to show you more analysis with respect to what we find from the stability hypothesis on the terrain and what different roughness characteristics of the terrain do to this relationship. So if you just bear with me for like 4 minutes.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so the stability hypothesis states that the tilt induced by the terrain is matched by the critical angle of tipping of the animal, which is related to the aspect ratio of the animal. So in other words, Z is the height perturbation, which between 2 points separated by a distance L, and it is given by a half normal distribution with variance that goes as the horizontal distance between 2 points. H is the roughness parameter that goes from 0 to 1. And as Madhav was asking what characterizes different roughness, and I'm going to show more data on this, it is a number which goes from 0 to 1 and tells you whether a surface is exactly plane or whether it is more undulating and showing high roughness statistics. So now Z and L together determine what my standing animal's base of support is, and that is related to what the height of the animal should be in order for it to remain stable. So the gist is that the terrain perturbation over a characteristic length scale L determined both the mass and the aspect ratio of the animal. So what we want to do is that for various different length scales that the animal scans while walking or locomoting on the terrain, find the distribution of Z and relate it to the aspect ratio and mass of the animal. And we want to see this relationship in the log space to be able to see the relationship over large orders of magnitude. So what I explained in words is what these figures are trying to show. I have a family of univariate ZL distribution. Z is the height perturbation, L is the length scale. For 3 representative length scales, I have shown what the distribution is like, and I hope you can see that the probability density changes as you go from bottom to top. We convert this into an aspect ratio to and mass space and see that these are the curves that we obtain, and by varying L, we populate the whole space of aspect ratio and mass, and these are the probability densities that we arrive at for what the terrain predicts as a marginally stable animal distribution statistics. I have overlaid all the data that we collected from 366 extinct and extant animals, and we see that the spread and the trend is followed by what we collected the data for. So this is a specific terrain for which H is equal to 0.3, and we choose that just because it fits the data best. However, changing H does not get rid of the trend. You would still see that the small animals need to sprawl and larger animals need to be more upright in order to remain stable on the surface of the terrain. We plot the locus of the modes of these family of univariate distributions, and that provide us with a scaling law. So we can also arrive at the same scaling by following a deterministic treatment to the stability hypothesis. And the only thing that has changed now is that we assume that Z is equal to, goes as the variance of the height perturbation perturbations on the terrain, and just using the terrain animal model and the stability hypothesis, these are the asymptotes we find. And this is the scaling relationship, which recovers the locus of the modes that we found in the probability treatment before. So the measurements from animals agree with the data and provide support for the stability hypothesis. So previously, I told you that muscle stress considerations have also been invoked to say that larger animals need to be more upright. So we use that on the animal to figure out. So as you're if you're more sprawling, the movement of the ground reaction force about the center of mass is larger, just because your movement arm is larger, and you need to support that weight using your muscle tensions. Using these governing relations, we arrive at a scaling between aspect ratio and mass, and it goes as this line, which shows that the slope is much shallower as compared to what the trend in the data is, or what is predicted by the stability hypothesis. Secondly, we also verify whether random evolution on the tree could give rise to the aspect ratio and mass scaling that we observed in our data. So this is the result from 10,000 Monte Carlo simulations, and we find that the slope, which the measured slope between data, which lies somewhere here, has a very low probability, less than 0.05, compared to what we obtained from the random evolution on the tree. We also perform a phylogenetic least square analysis, which considers the covariance between the traits. And it arises because the tree gives rise to relation. The aspect ratio and mass of the animals are not independent, because the animals are related to each other due to the phylogenetic tree. And this gives rise to a covariance matrix, which you need to consider when you're doing linear regression. And considering that, we find that aspect ratio and mass are still significantly correlated, with a p-value less than 0.05, even less than that. Okay, so in summary, I have told you that frontal profile of animals spanning 8 orders of magnitude from 28 milligrams to 22,000 kilograms follow the predicted scaling. Ancestral relationships cannot explain the origin of the scaling, and therefore provide support for the stability hypothesis, and further details in body plans may be determined by other ecological and developmental factors. Okay.
Neelima, can I ask one more question? Sorry.
Yes, please.
According to the theory, what controls the spread around the deterministic scaling law? According to the theory, I mean.
According to the theory, so you can, terrain is a fractional Brownian process, and the increments which we are interested in, which is the Z, are modeled as a fractional Gaussian noise. So it's nothing but a normal distribution, which is folded because how animals are symmetric in terms of whether they fall left or right. Mm-hmm. So now this distribution is a half normal distribution, and the variance of the distribution is related to what the spread of height perturbation, how the spread of height perturbations is spread about the mean of that distribution, which is what determines how fat this yellow region would be.
Thank you.
Okay, so that brings me to the end of the first part of my talk, where I highlighted the role of stability in animal form. And the second part of my talk is related to the role of stability in neural control. And the system of consideration here are index fingers. We want to study how finger stability is accounted for during decision grips. So here are examples of people doing precise tasks. They have to maintain their finger posture while they're applying precise fingertip forces. And there are studies which suggest that morphological features such as phalange ratios, a long thumb as compared to the index finger, fat finger pads, how the muscle tendon system is laid out are related to how you can perform dexterous tasks using your fingers. However, there are other studies which show that you can train a bonobo to perform precision tasks or become adept at tool making. So here's a bonobo whose name is Kanji, and he's trying to find a banana. And you can see that he precisely holds the tool in his hand or the thread and tries to break it open to reach the banana. So the point I want to highlight is that when you're precisely grasping an object, the posture of the finger is important. And the neural controller of finger determines whether or not you'll be able to precisely grasp an object. And that's what I'm going to talk about. So one kind of instability that finger suffers from when it's trying to apply fingertip forces is postural buckling. So if you, one second, yeah. So here is a subject who's producing high fingertip forces on the surface of a load cell. And we ask them to produce as high forces as they can without any consideration for stability. And we see that their finger buckles, which means that it's not able to maintain its posture. The whole event of buckling takes around 60 milliseconds. The rise of the DIP angle, which is the most distal angle here, with respect to time is exponential. And the time scale varies between 9 to 80 milliseconds, which is smaller than the fastest feedback delays in most of the cases, suggesting that feedback control cannot stabilize the finger posture against buckling when you're producing fingertip forces and you've started to buckle. So what is, if feedback cannot keep you stable while you're producing precision grasp, what is it that keeps you stable? So the muscle stiffness, which I talked about before as the first line of defense, is a potential candidate because as people have done experiments and found that as muscle tension increases, muscle stiffness also increases. So it is possible that when you're producing really high fingertip forces, your stiffness has also increased, and which is providing enough stiffness for postural stability. And that is the reason why you do not buckle all the time when you're precisely gripping an object, but it only happens occasionally, which could be due to motor noise or other effects. So we test this using a numerical experiment. We construct a planar model of an index finger, which has 1 degree of freedom. It is driven by 7 muscles, and activation of each muscle goes from 0 to 1. The optimization procedure we run is we maximize the distal fingertip force Fy and find what is the optimal fingertip force and what is the optimal activation pattern of the 7 muscles that gives rise to this maximal distal fingertip force. Here is a painting by Rembrandt, and I just want to highlight that they are looking at finger flexors, which are on this side of your hand and help you flex your index fingers. So this has historical importance. So back to the question, we find maximal distal fingertip forces and activation pattern. Now the distal fingertip force is associated with a minimum stiffness, which can allow the posture to remain stable when applying this fingertip force. Now the activation pattern, as I said, muscles produce stiffness as well as tension, and there's a simple relationship between them, lead to a muscle-induced joint stiffness matrix. And when you compare them, if muscle-induced joint stiffness is greater than the minimum stabilizing stiffness, then you remain stable, otherwise you become unstable. So what do we find? We find that these are the various numbers, and the muscle-induced joint stiffness is smaller than the minimum stiffness required for stability, which means that our finger buckles and does not remain stable. And this is the activation pattern associated with So in the previous slide, I told you that neural feedback control cannot stabilize you. And now I'm telling you that muscle stiffness is also not able to stabilize you when you're producing maximal fingertip forces. So what is it? How do you remain stable when you're grasping an object? And the answer could be that you rely on muscle stiffness to provide you a stable posture. However, your neural control is designed, prevents you from accessing activation patterns that will lead to an unstable posture. So how do we test this? We perform an experiment where we call in subjects, ask them to produce as high a force as they can on the surface of a load cell, but they're not allowed to become unstable. So they have to produce stable fingertip forces. And we give them 15 seconds, measure their fingertip forces, and measure activities from 2 flexors, which help you flex the index finger. So they are provided here. In the second condition, we attach a finger stiffening splint to the finger, which removes the constraint from the neural system to maintain a stable finger posture. And we find that when we have stabilized the finger posture, people are able to produce much higher forces, and their muscle activities are also higher as compared to the case of the free finger. So this is data from 38 subjects, and we see that finger force as well as flexor EMG increases as compared to the free finger. We also do another condition where we have a half splint that keeps your distalmost joint free, and we see similarly that fingertip force increases and EMG increases, however, not as much as for the full force condition. So this experiment suggests that people are stabilizing the finger makes people stronger because they are able to access previously unstable activation patterns to produce higher forces. So all I've talked about until now are high fingertip forces. However, this study also has implications for light fingertip forces, and this is because previous studies have shown that when people scale their fingertip force down, they simply scale their activation pattern also down, which means that the stiffness also scales down. However, so here is the example of the maximal, the A opt, which was producing maximal distal fingertip forces. And if the muscle-induced stiffness due to this activation pattern is lower than the minimum stabilizing stiffness, you can't simply scale down that activation pattern to remain stable. So stability constrains not only forces, but it also constrains the activation patterns. So there are a lot of activation patterns that can produce the same fingertip force. So here we scan the space of activation patterns to find a lot of activation patterns that produce a distal fingertip force of 9 Newton, which is much lower than the 42 Newton that highest fingertip force was. And you can see that there are some activation patterns which are unstable, given by a positive eigenvalue eta. B and K min are positive, so it doesn't matter. And on y-axis, we have the difference between the muscle-induced stiffness and joint-induced stiffness. So any unstable activation pattern scaling will produce unstable forces, whereas if you take activation pattern number 2 and scale it up and down, you see that it remains stable for any fingertip force that you can obtain by scaling. So this suggests that the activation patterns that are stable are co-contracted, by which I mean that if you have a joint and if you want to maintain a posture, you can co-contract your muscle, that is increase the activity in both the flexor and the extensor to increase the joint stiffness, however, not change the joint torques at all. So this is what I'm trying to show through this figure. There is no joint torque about this joint J. However, the stiffness can be modulated. Now, from our experiments, we see that splintered finger shows an increase in fingertip forces, and numerics suggest that free finger must be co-contracted. And this leads us to hypothesize that splintered finger achieves higher fingertip forces because it is able to decrease the co-contraction associated with the muscles. So how do we figure out using our experiments whether or not this is true? So this is what we do. For 16 subjects, We measure flexure activity as well as an extensor activity when they are producing fingertip forces, exactly the same experiment that we did before. And we find that we invoke Francis Coe's study where we find that people simply scale their activation pattern to produce lower forces. To find the force so we know the forces that people are producing without the sprint. We simply scale it up to find the activation pattern associated with the maximal forces with the sprint, which is generally higher. So if activation pattern is simply scaled up, that means there is no change from the linear scaling and there is no contraction. However, if the activation pattern is smaller from what the linear scaling tells you, then there is a decrease in flexure activity with respect to linear scaling, and in the opposite direction, there's an increase from the linear scaling. Similarly, we can do this for extensor activity, and by plotting the delta values of extensor versus flexor, if both the activities have decreased with respect to linear scaling, then we know that there is a decrease in co-contraction, and the first quadrant shows an increase in co-contraction. So for 16 subjects, by measuring flexure and extensor activity, this is what we find. We plot delta of extensor, which is the deviation away from linear scaling versus delta flexure, deviation away from linear scaling of flexures, and they lie in the fourth quadrant, which for both two joint sprint, which covers the whole finger, and the 1J sprint, showing that people are able to produce higher fingertip forces during the sprinting condition because they decrease their co-contraction. The second point of this figure is that people who do not show a change in their co-contraction pattern do not show a large change in their forces when a splint is added to the finger. So how do we think about this whole experiment? And I propose this diagram, which we will come back to later also. But if you have a force region, it is associated with stable and unstable regions. The unstable region is accessible to you only when splint is present, which is also associated with a change in the activation pattern and is not simply a linear scaling. And this is the maximal force that you could produce without a split. Okay, so in summary, I have told you that contact forces are limited by stability of the finger posture when you're producing fingertip forces during, let's say, a precision grip. The nonlinear elastic response of the muscle is responsible for contact stability, and free finger is co-contracted, most likely to ensure a stable finger posture because there are other non-co-contracted patterns that do not allow you to remain stable. Okay. So I've shown you this last diagram, which shows that there is a stable space and an unstable space, but what do we know what the space of stable and unstable activation patterns are? And this is the question we ask in the next chapter, which is related to the stability of tendon-driven systems. So before I explain to you what stable and unstable activation spaces may be, first I need to figure out what the minimum stabilizing stiffness is for a given active mechanical linkage. So this derivation that I'm going to show you, or the results that I'm going to show you, are not only applicable to a model of finger in contacts, which are shown here, but the derivation is more general and can be applied to any active mechanical linkage network with compliant joints and subject to holonomic constraints. So this is the force balance. It is the equation of motion of the active mechanical linkage. It is subject to certain holonomic constraints. The condition for equilibrium is given by this equation. Here, tau naught is the joint torque vector, and it is related to fingertip forces and configuration dependent forces in this manner. You can linearize it about your equilibrium posture to find this equation, which gives you the condition for a minimum stabilizing stiffness. this is related to the partial of the configuration dependent forces and the constraint forces in the system. So this is the minimum stabilizing stiffness matrix. However, we are interested in understanding tendon-driven systems such as musculoskeletal systems. So we consider again an active mechanical linkage with a random with any tendon layout, and how each tendon that's spanning the joint of your active mechanical linkage is associated with an activation A, as talked before, and this is related to joint torques linearly. R is simply a moment matrix of the muscle, and T is the peak tensions of each tendon, and A simply scales them. Now, each tendon has a stiffness associated with it, which is also linearly related to the activation in that muscle, and it just we use a similarity transform of the moment arm muscle about the joints to find a joint stiffness matrix. Now, if you want to maintain stability, you can pose an optimization problem where we minimize over a convex objective function, and this objective function could be anything of your choice. However, what's important is that we satisfy these torques and stability constraints in order to remain stable and maintain equilibrium when we are producing fingertip forces. So, however, this problem can be posed as an optimization problem only when we know that the constraints are convex in nature, which is what I'm going to show you next. So, definition of convexity: if I have two activation patterns that satisfy a condition, I want any arbitrary activation pattern on the line joining these two activation patterns in some high dimensional space to also satisfy that condition. So I consider the first condition, which is that my activation space or my activation vector has components which go only from 0 to 1. And this gives me a unit hypercube such as this, which is an example in 3D for 3 muscles. So each side is one muscle activation. It goes from 0 to 1, and the whole cube space tells you all the activation patterns that are possible. However, we also want equilibrium, and that imposes a linear constraint on the activation patterns that are allowed to you. And it translates into a plane which intersects the total activation cube and passes through the origin, because we have gotten rid of the configuration dependent forces. In addition, we consider the stability constraint, and it intersects this equilibrium plane. It is another plane which intersects the equilibrium plane and divides it into stable and unstable regions. So unstable, stable, marginally stable, and equilibrium regions are all convex in nature, and you can visualize them using a 3D space for 3 muscles, for example. Now, for an example of finger in contact, we know that we have 7 muscles, and therefore we need a 7-dimensional space to be able to visualize it. However, what we can do is we can take this equilibrium plane and take a circular embedding of it, which simply means that I have taken these vertices, plotted them on a circle, and connected them by lines which connect the equilibrium plane inside the hypercube. And for the a finger in contact with 7 muscles, this is the circular embedding of the equilibrium plane, which has been separated into unstable, stable nodes, and these stable and unstable nodes connect to each other through the separating marginally stable hyperplane. And you can see that these lines do not intersect stable, which is another way of saying that these regions are sort of convex. So understanding equilibrium plane in high dimension, 7D dimension is not easy. However, we can project it into a 2D space of forces. And these are the Fx and Fy forces force space. And we see that there is a stable space, there is an unstable space, and a marginally stable space. And all these spaces are convex because it's a linear transform from a high dimensional activation space to a low dimension force space. Okay, so the diagram that I showed you before related to forces is actually true, and we can find it. Now that we have shown that the constraints are convex, we can also pose this as an optimization problem. And here there are two different kinds of objective functions over which I minimize the activation patterns, and we see that we can find solutions using standard algorithms that are greater than minimum stiffness condition to maintain stability. Okay. So that's the design problem of open loop stable controllers. However, understanding that there's a stable and unstable space also has consequences for understanding the motor control of fingers. So now we know that activation patterns are inherently noisy, and minimum intervention principle states that when you're performing a task, there's a control space which is in general higher dimensional. For example, here I'm showing a activation space to force fingertip force mapping. The fingertip force is a 3D vector. The activation space is a control variable, which is a 7D vector, which means that the mapping is associated with a 4D null space. And the way motor systems achieve this task is to reduce the variability in the control variable they channel the variability of the control variable in the null space from the control variable to task mapping, and reduce it in the task relevant subspace. So this is an example of what I just said. For example, if you want to hammer a surface, you want to make sure that you're hitting the nail all the time. However, your joints can take various different configurations. However, the endpoint, which is the endpoint of the hammer, should always hit the same place. And this is what people do, and this has been proposed by Bernstein long ago. So this is posture to endpoint mapping, but study by Valerio and Madhu has shown that this is also true for muscles. So for example, activation to force mapping, we see that the variability in muscle activations is channeled in the irrelevant direction, which is the null space, as compared to the relevant direction. And you can see because this ratio is less than 1. And if it was random noise, you would have seen a value equal to 1. So now with the understanding we have developed on what is necessary for applying fingertip forces, equilibrium, that is equilibrium condition and stability condition, we include this in the task description and ask whether motor control channels variability in the null space of activation to stiffness mapping and activation to equilibrium plane mapping. So here eta is the relevant to irrelevant variance, and for various task relevant variables such as equilibrium, force, or combination of these, we find that the ratio of relevant to irrelevant variance is consistently lower than 1, which gives us, which tells us that motor control is actually paying attention to stiffness or equilibrium and channeling the variability in the null space to these task relevant variables. So we use, I didn't say this, we use the same data that the study used. It was generously provided to me by the study authors in order to be able to run this analysis. Okay, so in summary, we have found that stable and unstable activation spaces are convex. They are separated by a marginally stable hyperplane, and that they are convex allows us to pose this problem as an optimization problem, which can be solved using standard convex algorithms. And we find that muscles exhibit the properties or principle of minimum intervention when we consider the task description to contain all equilibrium, stiffness, and force conditions. Okay, so this brings me to the last part of my talk, which is on the stability of active mechanical linkages. So how to find the stable and unstable space of a tendon-driven linkage system, or find the minimum stabilizing stiffness for active mechanical linkage subject to constraints was only constrained to systems which were subjected to holonomic constraints. However, active mechanical linkages could be subjected to general Pfaffian constraints, which consists of both holonomic and non-holonomic constraints. So what do I mean by that? Holonomic constraints constrain the configuration space that is allowed to you. For example, a pendulum with an inextensible string will, the position of the mass at the endpoint will always be at a distance L from the point O. Non-holonomic constraints, on the other hand, impose an instantaneous constraint on the velocity. However, they do not impose a constraint on the total configuration space. For example, in parallel parking, you can't just slide your car into the empty space, but you have to maneuver it so that you can parallel park it. So the configuration space is available to you. However, it is not available instantaneously to you. Okay. So now, dealing with general constraint system, which is subject to holonomic and non-holonomic constraints, can be done by projecting the dynamics on the constraint manifold. So here, if I'm interested in the linearization of my dynamical system, I find the equilibrium point. I know that there's a constraint on which determines there's a constraint which determines the manifold, and the tangent space to the constraint is where my linearized dynamics live. And this is what is written mathematically here. P is the null space of my constraint, and a projection of the dynamics on the constraint tell me what my allowed dynamics are. So for a general active mechanical linkage subject to holonomic and non-holonomic constraints, it is simply a mass spring damper system with presence of constraints, and we can project it on the task relevant, we can project it on the constraint manifold, pose it as an quadratic eigenvalue problem, and solve for the eigenvalue eta. Now, we find that when the system has symmetric stiffness and damping matrices, but if it is subjected to holonomic constraints, then you can write the linearized term due to holonomic constraint as a potential, which is related to the constraint forces, and it gives rise to a symmetric stiffness-like matrix because it can be expressed as a potential. However, in the case of a non-holonomic constraint, you cannot show that the constraint term is related to a potential, and therefore, in general, it gives rise to an asymmetric matrix when you do a modal projection on the eigenvector that you may have either found through an experimental observation or through application-driven selection. This has consequences for what the eigenvalues can be when they are moving from the left half plane to the right half plane, and therefore has consequences for stability. So with symmetric stiffness and damping matrices in the system, if you subject that system to holonomic constraints, the only way it can become unstable is by traversing this real of eta equal to 0 line. However, if you have non-holonomic constraints, you can either traverse this line or become unstable by having a finite imaginary component. And physically, how this is realized is that the red line is related to static buckling instabilities. However, the blue line is related to flutter instabilities, which show oscillation as a behavior. So I told you that holonomic constraints are associated, the forces due to holonomic constraints are associated with a potential, which could be destabilizing, stabilizing, or have another strange form. So for example, if you have a non-convex constraint, it is a destabilizing, it presents a destabilizing stiffness to the system, and you want a opposing scalar potential to be added to the system in order to be able to stabilize it. So all my previous talk about finding the minimum stabilizing stiffness to stabilize a finger posture or any active mechanical linkage using minimum stabilizing stiffness essentially boils down to this picture. You have a constraint which can be destabilizing or have other forms where it is stabilizing in certain directions but destabilizing in other directions, or is totally stabilizing. And the way to stabilize the system is to add a stiffness term to it, which counteracts the destabilizing effect due to constraint forces. Okay, so in summary, I have what I've just told you is that active mechanical linkages with non-circulatory stiffness, damping, and without any and subject to holonomic constraints can only destabilize by static buckling. However, the same mechanical linkage, but subject to non-holonomic constraints, can either exhibit static buckling or flatter instability. And these analyses can be extended to other systems with gyroscopic, circulatory, feedback, stiffness, and damping terms, which will be in general asymmetric matrices and therefore can be broken down into symmetric and asymmetric terms and analyzed further for what kind of instabilities may exist in the system and how to stabilize them. So that brings me to the concluding slide. I hope that I have convinced you that the need for mechanical stability is important and has consequence for both animal morphology, such as we saw in the scaling of aspect ratio with size of the animal, for maintaining lateral stability on uneven terrain, and that neural control learns strategies which keep you stable in tasks which are extremely important, such as precision grasping in humans. And with that, I would like to acknowledge my advisor and my lab, funding sources, and a lot of people who helped me with different parts of my PhD. Thank you.
Thank you. We now open for questions. Because of the strange microphone arrangement in this room, I appear to be shouting at Neelima. That's just so that a faint voice still carries through the microphone, but I request Neelima to repeat questions people in the room may ask. Feel free to type questions in chat and I can convey it to Neelima, or just unmute yourself and please pitch in with your question. You may have to repeat that.
I have a few questions.
Yes.
I think John is frozen.
I will. I guess I'll put them in the chat if and someone else can ask.
Yeah. Does John ask you a question?
Yeah, I was. So there, I had 3 questions.
Yes, please.
In the first part of your talk, there was a discussion about Gaussian. The theory is Gaussian, but the data that you plotted for aspect ratio versus mass didn't. So I'll just ask the 3 questions and then you can answer. So the data itself, it wasn't clear whether that data was had higher order moments, and if it does, yeah, that one. If it does, why? So that's one question. But yeah, so did you analyze the statistics of the actual data in this figure, and are there more than 2 moments? That's the first question. The second question is about the study with finger stiffness. When
Yes.
you added the splint,
Yeah.
then you it just occurs to me during the Olympics, weightlifters, all the athletes, they put braces on their knees, their elbows, and so forth. And the question is that cheating? So that's the second question. And if so, how? And how would you deal with that? Results. Number three was the last part. You saw in the case where versus non-holonomic constraints that you had either a static instability, a buckling instability, or you had the coexistence of flutter versus buckling. It occurs to me that that is a statement of what's called exchange of stabilities for generalized eigenvalue problems. And I just wonder if you wanted to comment on how that connection is made. So those are my three questions. Thanks for your talk.
Okay. Okay. So the first question is, if I've analyzed the higher movements in the data in this figure, and the answer is that I haven't. So what happens is that Z, or the terrain height perturbations, are Gaussian. The distribution of terrain height perturbations is Gaussian. However, what we are interested is in the absolute value of this distribution, which leads to a transform, which gives me a half normal distribution of the height perturbations that I'm interested in with respect to a certain value L. I haven't analyzed if there are higher moments, and I haven't thought about how I would go about addressing this question. So,
okay.
Yeah, I will think about it, and maybe we can chat later. The second question is about splint, and if people in Olympics are cheating. Well, they're using their brain, which is present in their body, to figure things out. I don't think they're cheating. And if everyone is allowed to do something, it's fine. It's just about figuring things out. It may be a mental strategy or physical strategy. So I don't think they're cheating. Flutter versus buckling is exchange of stabilities. Yes. So I have thought about, I want to move the slide. Just a second. This is right. Yeah. So if you have holonomic constraints, you can either become unstable by a pitchfork bifurcation, or transcritical bifurcation, or there is one more. However, the other one is an Andronov-Hoff bifurcation. So can you actually reframe your question in other words? What would you like me to comment on? There is exchange of stabilities in the sense that the eigenvalues change there. For example, in transcritical bifurcation, there is exchange of stabilities in terms of which eigenvalue becomes unstable after a critical buckling load. And there is exchange of stabilities in the sense that the system is stable when it's in the left half plane versus it becomes unstable when it's in the right half plane. So if you can tell me if you can just repeat your question, that will help me a lot.
Just normally in the generalized eigenvalue problem, standard procedure is to assume exchange of stabilities.
Yeah.
And that procedure then assumes that if the real part of the growth rate is 0, then it implies that the complex part is 0.
Yes.
That's I just that in order to that exist adjoint eigenvalue. And so I'm just wondering if you have a comment about the relationship between that and the imposition of constraints, because you get two different results depending on whether you have holonomic versus non-holonomic constraints.
So when you have a holonomic constraint, all you have, so I can talk about this in terms of the eigenvalues. So how do I know whether whether non-holonomic constraints goes, let me say this again. Okay, so if a system is subject to holonomic constraints, all I have are symmetric terms in this quadratic eigenvalue problem, which means that the only way system can become unstable is when the stiffness damping has no effect on when the system becomes unstable, or the critical activity needed in the system to become unstable, and it's only the K and F naught L terms which determine when the system will become unstable. However, when you have a non-holonomic constraint, there may be an asymmetric term which leads to an imaginary term in the whole quadratic eigenvalue modal projection, which is what causes you to have a pair of complex eigenvalues or imaginary eigenvalues that leads to flutter. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but I think that's what I have. I think the question is, why don't holonomic constraints lead to an oscillatory instability? And I don't think I have a physical understanding of why they won't.
Okay, we should, I don't want to dominate this question session, but I just, something for you to think about is that you do an experiment. You actually are not clear whether you have a mix of holonomic versus non-holonomic constraints. And then you do the observation, and that the distinction between this picture you have on the lower right and what you observe is not necessarily obvious.
Yes.
And therefore, therefore, the question of exchange of stabilities, as I framed it, maybe not clearly, is sort of very, very important with respect to this part of your thesis. But thanks for dealing with it. I'll shut up now.
Thank you for the questions. I will think more about them.
Yes. There's a question in the room.
So I'm really interested in this relationship between the size of the animals, their mass, and their aspect ratio. And I'm thinking about some of the organisms that sit really low to the ground, like sprawled out like bugs and salamanders, have been much bigger in the past than they are now.
Yeah.
And so like I know with bugs that millipedes can be several meters long. One of the reasons for that was related to the oxygen in the atmosphere. But when you have something like the salamander that was 3 meters long and now it's this big, in terms of the terrain you were talking about, how that impacts their stability, is there anything that you might suggest in the past made it more feasible to be that big?
So what I showed you with regards to terrain does not preclude sprawling animals from inhabiting the terrain, in the sense that, well, everything has a non-zero probability, so any animal can exist. However, we see that marginal stability or high probability density regions are associated with the data points that we have collected. Extremely sprawling animals, for example, crocodiles are extremely sprawling and they still exist. And such animals, like crocodiles or alligators and reptiles, turtles, etc., have other pressures on them. For example, they have to navigate the aquatic environments where they have to present a slender cross-section to water, or other ecological constraints which may exist that may determine how your aspect ratio should be. However, extremely sprawling means that you will always remain stable, right? Yeah. Not always, but in most cases.
I have a bad internet connection, so can I ask a question?
Yes.
This is Andy Ruin calling.
Oh, hi.
Hi, thanks for inviting me. In your oscillatory instability, do you have
Maybe Andy tries without the video. It seems to be on show.
I can't hear the in the room comment.
Can you convey the comment to Andy?
Andy, if you switch off your video, maybe we'll be able to hear you better. We can't
Okay,
hear
my question. Instability.
we missed the important part of the question.
I try again. Do you have a simple example of the oscillatory instability? Simple example of oscillatory instability.
For example, people wearing rolling skates or ice skates. Skates are a non-holonomic constraint, and they are, well, people are skating on a surface. This is a speculation. I haven't analyzed this, but they get into these oscillatory instabilities when they are skating and are going at high speed. Sorry?
The famous oscillatory instabilities of non-holonomic systems are all not relative to an equilibrium. Your theory is about relative to an equilibrium.
Yeah.
So do you have an example of an oscillatory instability relative to an equilibrium configuration?
Nothing comes to mind right now.
Okay.
Sorry about that, but I'll think about it. And I've done simulations where I have applied a non-holonomic constraint at the end of a 3-bar linkage, and it does exhibit oscillatory instability about an equilibrium position, but I don't know of a physical realization where such instability could arise about an equilibrium position.
Okay.
Thank you for that question. I'll think more about it.
An example, but I'm not sure. I've been done the calculation.
Can you repeat, Andy, what you said, because we missed you?
Oh, sorry. I think I know an example, but I haven't worked it out to make sure that it is an example.
I see. I would like to talk to you at some point.
But I think, you know, the famous ones like bicycles and trailers and so on are not examples for your theory. I don't think.
Yeah.
Did you hear me or no? I'm in horrible internet land, so sorry.
Okay.
Are there any more questions? A quick survey of we don't let me get up there and do something like this. If there are no more questions, which I don't see hands or voices, or hands here, let's thank Neelima and take a brief break before we switch over to the closed session. Anyone who is a faculty member is welcome to stay for the closed session, but I would request others to please step out at this point. But let's thank Neelima first for the time.
I think I don't want to stay for the whole closed session, but maybe I could make a comment or two when that starts.
Oh, yes.
If I'm allowed to.
Oh, yes.
I'm afraid.
Please do.
Yes.
Hello, Andy, please do.
Yes.
You have
Okay.
the